this time, I would like to introduce David, Kenneth, and Nicholas.
Hello, folks.
How's it going, guys?
Hi, everyone.
Hey, how are you?
Welcome. And thanks for joining us as we chat about bridging mass interpersonal divide. I'm going to start with sort of the story of how this book and sort of how this approach kind of came together. When I was several years ago, when I was working at West Virginia University, I used to teach the Intro to Media course. And there, like many places, it was an introductory to media effects course. And that was fine. It was okay. I liked teaching certain parts of it especially. But I found myself one day while teaching the course kind of boring myself. I don't even remember exactly what chapter we were talking about. And if you teach media effects, that's totally cool because obviously I didn't bore myself all the time, but I did. And while I was talking, I was thinking, man, I'm boring myself. And if I'm boring myself, I must be boring everyone who's sitting in here. This was like a 300-person class, so that was a lot of boredom. And so I asked myself, you know, what would a media class that I really wanted to teach look like? You know, someone should do this. And then I realized, well, damn, I can't pass it off anyone anymore. If someone should do this, I guess that someone is me, along with my partners here as well, Kenneth and Nick. So that was sort of where this approach came together, was me just kind of thinking about initially, what would I like to see if I wanted to create sort of a media comm course that I think is more future focused? What would it look like? And that's really where sort of this approach comes from. And I think both Ken and Nick would agree that that's sort of the approach that you all appreciate as well, right?
Definitely.
Yes.
So that's where we start with all of this, and we kind of think this is important, and this is one of the reasons why. There's a quote up on the screen right now that talks about the importance of technology and sort of where what it does, the positive effects it can have, as it's, you know, the second part of this saying they empower individuals to do things they could have never dreamed before, but also empower folks who are very dangerous to spread dangerous messages. And we see this more and more through technology. It's a powerful tool. And our approach to thinking about sort of technology in this combining of mass and interpersonal is to think about it that way, as a powerful tool that is capable of allowing a lot of really positive things, but also helping a lot of negative things. And our goal is to think more about it, to learn more about it, to understand, and hopefully be able to use it more for the positive side of things rather than the negative. And this quote actually, this was a part of President Obama's South by Southwest keynote speech in 2016. And I think this quote really encapsulates the importance and the need to study mediated communication in the communication discipline more and more so. So we already talked about that. We'll jump past that. So really, what we're going to talk about today, as was kind of mentioned, is four things. We're going to first kind of introduce this idea of mediated communication as a concept. Don't really think it's anything brand new, but kind of focus on the highlights that as we see it. Talk about some ways that we see kind of incorporating mediated communication into the communication curriculum. Talk about a little bit about using the same technologies that we teach about to help us teach mediated communication. And then we hope to have some questions and answers from everyone who's out there listening. So that's what we've got on tap for today. So as a concept, we would say that mediated communication is communication at its first and foremost, sort of the starting point of all of this. And there's lots of definitions of communication. One that I think we all agree we kind of gravitate somewhat toward is the definition of communication from McCroskey and Richmond, which sets up sort of this basic idea. It comes from a maybe more interpersonal perspective, but suggests that, you know, communication is about stimulating meaning. It's about getting meaning across to another person using verbal, nonverbal messages. We would include textual messages as verbal as well, and also video, since, you know, we're going to talk about media comm as part of this. And so really underlying all of this idea of mediated communication is this goal of getting meaning across to somebody, whatever the channel. And we're going to move on to talk about that some more as well.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll jump in here too, talking about mediated communication and kind of the difference between thinking of traditional mass communication and thinking about this concept of mediated communication. And, much like Dave, I experienced a great deal of dissatisfaction with kind of the way in which I was teaching Intro to Mass Comm a few years back, and kind of the way in which it was sort of typified or presented as being somehow distinct from interpersonal and organizational communication. And what I kept finding too was that in many of the extant texts, there was sort of this approach where, okay, this is what mass communication is, and then we're going to break it down by the medium. So here's newspapers, here's magazines, here's television, here's radio, here's the internet, right? This sort of like broken or fragmented approach. And it was one that was really based in Shannon and Weaver's work on information theory. And I'm sure you've seen this this conceptual diagram before. It's the SMR model, right? So sender, message, and receiver. Well, Shannon and Weaver were sort of developing this understanding of how communication and mass communication works, coming out of looking at telegraph wires and telephones and the copper wire transmissions, where you have receivers that are encoding some kind of message and trying to disseminate it to, or sorry, senders encoding some kind of message, then trying to like broadcast it to receivers and experiencing noise in between, right? This very linear kind of top-down approach to understanding mass communication or transmission and reception. And we've tried to move a little bit beyond that. And one article that I know kind of impacted much of our thinking. Can we advance the slide? I'm not sure if there we go. Kind of really impacted our thinking in the conceptualization of the book was an article by Chafee and Metzger back in 2001 in Mass Communication and Society called "The End of Mass Communication?" ? And in that particular article, Chafee and Metzger kind of lay out this distinction between mass communication and maybe media communication, right? And sort of addressing the way in which the lines between interpersonal and mass comm are beginning to blur, right? So we're migrating from having very few channels to having nearly a limitless number of available resources on Web 2.0. We're moving from looking at like this large, relatively anonymous audience who are all consuming the same information to a very diverse and fragmented audience. We're moving away from control being entirely in the hands of the transmitter to control being in the hands of the user who is collecting. And so on and so forth. So we're moving away from this model of kind of top-down sender, message, receiver, and more towards the notion that we interact with mediated communication and we use it as a tool. We use it to obtain the things that we want, whether it's information, whether it's entertainment, whether it's connection with other human beings, affective needs, whatever the case may be. We're moving away from this very top-down approach to one that kind of resembles a number of different communication dynamics, but just happens to be mediated through some kind of technology. So we really wanted to break that mold and get away from that top-down approach and more towards one that looks at interactivity and a much more nuanced kind of understanding of how we use these technologies.
That's right. And as we move forward, something that Ken talked about is this sort of as we move away from a top-down approach, we can start thinking about bottom-up. Well, what do folks do when they communicate, right? So you take something, as we look at these channels, and I think the history of our field is very much focused on those channels, and channels can do things and they can't do other things, right? But take something like Facebook, that, you may have an account where you post publicly every day, what you're eating, how you're feeling, your new job, your new puppy, and you have 15,000 followers who pick up those messages and share them. Or on the converse side, you have Coca-Cola handling customer service for one individual client publicly on their Facebook wall for their millions and millions of followers to see, right? And as the three of us sort of took some inspiration from a scholar named O'Sullivan, who sort of suggested that maybe what we should do is somewhat get away from trying to attach a communication function to a communication channel, and instead just looking at, well, what do people do with these things? So for example, if you focus on a message, you have some messages that are very private that you don't really get access to. If I send my colleagues an email and I keep it to the three of us and I use their first names and I talk about their families, it's a message that's highly personalized. I have to know that person well enough to write that message, deliver it to them. But that can be through a telephone call. It can be through any number of different forms. I could put up a proposal on a stadium, video screen that has a highly sensitive inside joke that only me and my partner understand. But that also seems very public because everybody can see it, right? So some of the things we talk about now are message personalization and the extent to which I craft something that's for one individual and their sort of idiosyncratic nuances and how well we know each other versus a message that's very, very, very public for everybody to see. And, very, very public. We can also talk about exclusivity of the message, right? Whether or not it's physically handed to a single person versus whether or not it's viewable by everybody. So in other words, we can personalize things. We can make things more or less exclusive. But personalization and exclusivity, which are things that communication scholars would study, can exist in all sorts of different formats and all sorts of different channels. Just like Facebook in front of us probably fits all of these things really well. We can message each other during this conversation and talk about our lunch plans, or we could tell them to the entire audience listening right now and ask what your lunch plans are, right? We can really mix these things up. So we see that communication technologies, if you are teaching them to your students, disrupt a lot of the ways that we think about communication technology and mass media. And kind of our answer as comm scholars is because people have been communicating for a very long time, and now they're using the technologies in front of them to make them work for the communicators and not the other way around. And of course, Facebook's a good example because a lot of us have touched it in some way. But we even see things like Dear Abby column, right? So you had this column in newspapers through most of the 20th century where folks would write in these highly private parts of their lives and share them with an anonymous woman who doesn't really exist, right? And have her answer love advice and romance advice. And this was a really good example of messages that were highly private in nature, and yet were very, very available to everybody in a syndicated column in hundreds and hundreds of international newspapers. And by the way, Dear Abby is still on Twitter today. So we also like to reinforce to our students that these ideas, and as Dave mentioned earlier, they're not so much that they're new, but sometimes when you study technology, you forget how much of the stuff we've actually been doing for a very long time. And that's one of the approaches that our texts and our courses try to explain, is that functional approach to these technologies.
Yeah, and I think that's in many ways you're right. I mean, that's really the approach that we all take, I think, to thinking about mediated communication is technology changes a lot, but and massively so, and those changes are important, and they allow, as we started, quote, they allow us to do an awful lot of stuff, but in the end, we still seem to want to do the same stuff we've always wanted to do. We have the same functions for communication we've always wanted. We want to be informed. We want to form relationships. We want to persuade and be persuaded. We want to be entertained. And so a lot of those functions that kind of have been sometimes thought of as mass or interpersonal, because of technology, they cut across both of those. And so even if the mode and some of the usage of technology has changed, and obviously will continue to do so, and it's important to think about those things, the goals don't. And that's why, in our view, when we think about mediated communication, it really is, to us at least, communication that uses media. And that's, that seems like a pretty simple definition, I think. But that, I think, is an important one because it does allow us to kind of put in all these things that have sometimes been siloed apart from each other and realize that maybe we're doing all of this at the same time. And we thus put more emphasis when we think about MC, or mediated communication. More emphasis is on the communication than the mediation. However, the mediation still is really important. And the technologies that we use sometimes allow us to do certain things or limit us in some ways, but we tend to be pretty good at overcoming those limitations.
Right, and they're not necessarily deterministic. They don't sort of necessarily constrain to the extent that we once thought they did. Yes.
Yeah, we definitely try taking a descriptive approach to this, right? I think our orientation as scholars for our courses for our students is to make sure that we don't just tell them that there's a good way of communicating and a bad way of communicating, that, face-to-face is the way you're supposed to communicate. And if you use other technologies, you're sort of using mass comm wrong or using interpersonal comm wrong, right? As part of the idea is it's a very descriptive text. We're trying to explain, here is the world around you. that you're probably experiencing every day, whether you're on this call now or talking to your parents later. But there's a scholarly attachment behind a lot of those reasons, some theories and concepts, like Dave said, of communication, that what sounds like a simple definition, it only sounds simple until you start studying it and playing with it and realizing that we don't think of it this way. We tend to attach certain value statements to certain technologies. And while it can be good or bad, I think the important thing to step back as instructors and as scholars is to say, well, here's the state of communication today through the many screens that we experience the world with.
Yeah. So with that in mind, one of our goals really is to kind of show how this can be incorporated, this idea of mediated communication into the curriculum, rather than like maybe the traditional interpersonal or the traditional mass comm course, and kind of thinking about putting these together maybe as a single course, because these are the ways that our current comm majors, for example, and future comm majors, we think at least it's important for them to think about this. This helps them kind of have maybe not necessarily a leg up, but a leg up in the workplace and in society, because these are questions obviously we have to deal with today and we'll continue to have to deal with for some time. And so we think that this actually in many ways is an important avenue and an aspect or way of thinking about even like the introductory basic communication course, because our approach is on the functions of communication, and then thinking about how does the media, how does technology help us, hinder us, impact us in terms of accomplishing those functions.
Right.
And so kind of mention those functions, but just to get us started, sort of our approach, and the book kind of fits this as well, is to think about how do we kind of make some of these ideas of mediated communication come alive and help students kind of understand the context behind, the history behind, the future ahead of thinking about communication in this way. So we have throughout these ideas of mediated communication and action, which are sort of call outs to things that we thought at least were kind of interesting or worthy of extra kind of fun, I guess, I think fun at least, thoughts about this stuff. And so this is one, for example, that's in pretty early in the book, and we use this one to kind of demonstrate many things about the internet and about technology and communication. One of them, though, is that the future is kind of hard to predict. And, you know, all kinds of, I mean, lots of technologies are coming on. MySpace was going to be the thing, and it was for a little while until it got sold to Justin Timberlake for like $35 million. And it wasn't the thing anymore. Yik Yak, we've seen come and gone. Google Glass, we've seen come and go. So the technologies come and go and they change. And it's hard sometimes to predict the specific technologies. As we see, we've got, you know, this is always one of my favorite examples, because I always show this one to my students. Say, anytime, you know, you're wrong about future predictions, you're not the only one. And so, although I also like this one too, because Cliff Stoll in 2010 pointed out, yeah, I was kind of wrong in that article, which is what we've got on the other side of the slide here. But I use this one, and we use this one to kind of think about the idea of technology and the future being hard to predict. And that's why, again, we kind of focus on this idea of the functions of communication instead, because those seem a lot easier to predict, a lot less likely to change, and certainly not going to change as fast as the technology itself is going to. So that's really sort of our approach. And we talk about the functions. So we kind of have the book and our approach generally to this idea is set up with sort of 4 general functions of communication. The first one is using mediated communication for information.
Yeah, so, you know, one of the things that is very challenging to think about as we go into this new age of mediation, or this sort of a proliferation of mediation, right, is where our information comes from anymore. I think historically, our relationship with information is that some entity or organization or produces it, distributes it in some way, whether it's a newspaper or whether it's, you know, a town crier or the earliest days of the internet. We consume that information and then we move on. And then if we want other information, we find other sources. But as audience members, as consumers, our role has historically been very passive. We can clamor for certain things. We can want certain things. Certainly, Nielsen ratings can tell a company what shows to make and what shows not to make. But at the end of the day, the production of information and the distribution of information, very heavily mass, right? One entity, very large, very complicated, distributing messages to lots of anonymous people with not a whole lot of targeting. And then we come to the Web 2.0, this notion of creation and collaboration. And anybody who's ever touched Wikipedia before, I don't know if anybody here has actually written Wikipedia articles, we learn or had students turn them in, and we have to explain where that information came from. And it turns out nobody knows where the information came from, because that's how the system works. At the same time, the information is surprisingly accurate, as we talk about in our book. That the user and the producer and the consumer don't enjoy that bifurcation line anymore. They're not so easily separated from each other. And whether it's to everybody's benefit, you know, if 100 people chime in about the history of West Virginia University football, we get a really good, well-rounded history that maybe the people in charge didn't know about certain rituals and things. We also have the fake news endemic, right, where suddenly everybody's crafting every story and sharing it, and then suddenly we have folks crafting more information than truly exists in the world. But we talk a lot about that, and we talk about this idea of being a netizen, being a member of the information community in the book, and how that changes the way that we consume messages, and the idea that those have mass and interpersonal influences, right? You know, when your friends and family are also changing the messages you read. Then we can go a step further to what's called the semantic web, where now when we are online and we are leaving trace behaviors as we search the internet or purchase things on Amazon or have conversations through social media, that our algorithms start customizing our information for us. It's as if that if Ken and Dave and I all picked up a book and that book was able to listen to us throughout the week, we get a different book in response. Right? And it's an information system that we're still learning how to navigate that. We're still learning how to understand where this information comes from. And, you know, that book, which was supposed to be very mass and very static and everyone reads the same pages, or that web page, suddenly is the case that we are all consuming different narratives and different bits. And when we talk to each other, we may not even have the same information. And sometimes folks will talk about this as an inherently bad thing. And I point out that the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in 2001 was announced by a guy living in an apartment who was complaining about helicopters flying overhead. And before you know it, he slowly realized that he was live tweeting one of the 21st century's most important historical events. That didn't come from the Associated Press. It didn't come from an organization. It came from a board guy who days after he announced it, he had to remind people on Twitter that he's not a news organization. I'm just a guy who programs computers. My life's not that interesting. Please stop following me. So just one example of this merging and blending of the mass and interpersonal taking place through technologies that even today that we're still learning and trying to come to grips with.
And so another big reason we communicate is to form relationships and to relate to other people. We're a social species. We are a really social species. And so a technology that allows us to communicate and connect with other people is one that's going to be heavily used for that purpose. In many ways, this is sort of what got me into this idea of mass personal, emerging of mass interpersonal. Was I was more of a traditional mass comm scholar, as all three of us actually were. And as I started thinking more about mass comm as a grad student, I realized, wait, people use this stuff to talk to each other too. Maybe we should think more about this. And so when we think about relationships and how we use media and technology to communicate and to relate to other people, I think it's important to first realize that we can and we do this. We form impressions of other people. We form relations with other people, and we do it a lot through technology. Sometimes we're inaccurate. Sometimes things don't go well. That's true of face-to-face interactions as well. And so we try to focus it more on how do we do it? What happens? What kinds of things are we utilizing? As Nick mentioned before, instead of it just being all bad or all good, we try to focus our thinking on, well, how do we utilize what we have to accomplish this goal of relationship formation? It doesn't mean it's all good, but again, we don't think it's all necessarily negative either. And so a couple things that are up here right now are some of the things that we try to think about in terms of how do we do relational work through technology. It's not enough just to have more cues, as the story about the death of Clippy shows. Clippy, we tried to have more cues. It didn't work. People hated Clippy, partly because Clippy was annoying. But you know, just like a person who might be annoying, you might not form as much of a relationship with that person either. And so a lot of this actually ends up looking in many ways like face-to-face interpersonal communication, at least in terms of the things we're utilizing. We just happen to have technology that allows us to maybe have even a greater flood and amount of the communication as well. And so when we do, as we mentioned before, sometimes we think about what's not there in tech and we focus on that. If it's not there, we can't do it. But we're pretty creative as a species. We want to accomplish goals. We find ways to do it. And so things like emoticons and emoji are creating, I think at least, I think we all would agree that it's sort of its own language that is created to be able to utilize what is available. And these aren't new. It seems that Abraham Lincoln may have used an emoticon, at least in a text of a speech from 1862. It may have been a misprint, whatever. It's a fun story either way. But certainly, we've gotten to a point where we have moved to be able to utilize these things. And if you don't understand the language of, say, emoji, for example, then you're not going to get much meaning out of it, just like any other language that we might use sort of face-to-face as well. And so our focus, again, is thinking about how do we utilize these things for this purpose? What are the challenges? What are the skills? What are the affordances as well that allow us to maybe sometimes do things better?
Great.
Mm-hmm. You know, something else that we thought of too while we were thinking about the larger structure of the book was looking at the student outcomes that might be impacted by learning about media communication and what the long-term goals for our students might be. And I think I probably speak for all three of us in that many of my students go on to careers in advertising and public relations and marketing. So another piece that we wanted to structure in was addressing the notion of using media communication for persuasive purposes. And again, what we kind of do, bouncing off of the Chafee and Metzger article, is break it down into the ways in which our conventional assumptions regarding how persuasion works from a messaging standpoint might be challenged by kind of the shifts in the environment. And again, many of the classic theories that are out there, whether they're modeling theories, dual process theories, or rational actor theories, revolve around this notion of a linear message to which somebody then responds. There's a lot of variability happening here too. So for example, in their looking at how, or their discussion of how modeling works and social cognitive approaches work, Chafee and Metzger talk about how now you can actually interact with behavioral models rather than just observing them and learning from them and imitating the behavior. In a virtual environment, maybe you can actually interact with others in different ways. And it could be the case too that some of that modeling isn't intentional, right? So think of language norms and emoji use and abbreviations and other sort of like linguistic and behavioral norms that have evolved over the course of the last 15 years as a product of modeling and of seeing what other people are doing in virtual environments, right? So that's one thing we kind of try to address is how does modeling and how does learning work? Another piece we discussed in chapter 9 of the text and we try to work on is the notion of the role of involvement in persuasion, right? And we've kind of typically thought of persuasive endeavors as revolving around higher or lower involvement events. Well, if you're participating in an interactive environment, chances are you have some degree of involvement or active information seeking that brought you there to begin with. So we have to sort of think about how persuasion works in that context, in the context of people actively seeking out information and what types of message strategies will work best in that context. At the same time, it's also the case that we get ads, right? We get pop-ups, we get banners coming across the screen. We get interrupted while we're broadcasting or engaging in a Skype chat. So these varying degrees of involvement are still happening from a persuasive standpoint, but they're just manifesting a little bit differently. So we try to talk about dual process. We deal with the ways in which Cialdini's keys to persuasion, right? So reciprocity, authority, social proof, etc., might shake out in interactive environments. And we also deal with exemplification to an extent. I mean, we have access to a much broader range of persuasive material online than we have in network or cable television. So are there iconic exemplars or persuasive messages that revolve around really emotionally arousing messages that can be used to persuade people to adopt a certain technology or product or service or belief or behavior? So we kind of try to address that too, again, bouncing off of the Chafee and Metzger model to break down how our traditional thinking on persuasion might be changing and how our students can perhaps use that in on-the-job decisions they might make down the road.
And the last thing we think about with media, right, I think historically, and certainly one of my areas of research, is entertainment, right? And like, what do we do when we're not busy doing other stuff, when we're just trying to restore our psyche and take a break from the day, or maybe we're trying to learn things on our own and pursue our own activities and happiness. And one of the things we talk a lot about in the book about entertainment, first we present it as a serious form of media studies, which is something that often doesn't come up in mass context. I think oftentimes you see informational, functional, but because of some of a normative approach to media, we don't often see a discussion of entertainment. In fact, the earliest definitions of the role of mass comm in society didn't even include entertainment as a function of the media. But of course it is functionally. It's one of the things we spend our money and our time with. And we speak a lot in the book about how technologies have taken entertainment, and two main shifts we can talk about are the on-demand nature of entertainment and its highly immersive nature. And of course, by on-demand, it's this notion that, as I have this sort of black box in my pocket, I can choose to be in any number of worlds that satisfy any number of long-term and short-term desires, right? I could be watching TV right now, in fact, and just kind of pop it up over here, and it may be none the wiser that I'm watching old soccer reruns or something like this. I have on the screen right now this cave painting. It's considered, some of us who are media scholars, consider this one of the oldest forms of media. It was a painting for children to understand their culture and to worship this deity and to understand who we are as a people. Well, Instagram's not that much different, right? I mean, we take photos of our environment using the technology that's available to us, and those things that we think are important that will entertain each other, we share them left or right. For me, it's every beer and sandwich I've had for the last 10 years. And, there's even an artist in New York City who's been charging $90,000 a piece for prints of other people's Instagram posts. And we talk in the book about how that could possibly happen and why anybody would want to see that as an artifact of a larger society. And of course, you have things like the Oculus Rift and these three-dimensional headsets that, again, can sync up with very basic technologies to immerse our senses. And we can feel a sense of spatial presence to where we have this illusion of non-mediation and a whole new world. And so here we are using media, but tapping into somebody's sense of space and their sense of self and their conversation with other people at an interpersonal level to make them feel like there's no media at all. So in some ways, it's a really good metaphor for a lot of the book that we're talking about, because we're very much trying to engage people's uses of these technologies and the effects of that usage.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too, because it points out that the functions sometimes cut across each other as well, right? I mean, and so that's why it's important, I think, to think about them and think about why are we using media, why are we using technology, and then how does the technology fit in and impact those functions as well.
And by no means are they mutually exclusive. I mean, that which persuades can also entertain. That which builds relationships can also persuade, et cetera, and so on. Absolutely. Yeah.
We talk about them out here as a way to help students kind of walk through these functions and realize that these functions aren't that new. But once they understand, I think, the components individually in these nice 4 modules, stitching them together towards the end of a semester or the end of a paper or something like that, that oftentimes ends up being the intellectual work at the end.
Yeah. All right. So how do we use some of this stuff?
Yeah, I can very quickly suggest that one of the things we tried to do is, in a sense, practice what we preach a little bit. And so when we were developing this textbook, we decided that one sort of value add, one bonus we could have for the students and for the adopters as well, is to try to create some online spaces and online communities. And what we've done here is we've created a Facebook space with Kendall Hunt that is open to really anybody. Not everybody using it is necessarily an adopter, but most of the students in there are people who have used the book in the past, or there are faculty members who are using the book right now. And we try to connect all the different learning groups that are sort of spread out across the continent to each other as a way to share and engage some of the ideas. So many of the examples you gave earlier in the presentation are taken from the textbook. And oftentimes in those textbook discussions, there's a link back to the social media space. I don't know if we can get it up on screen, but you can imagine in your mind, it's a Facebook group that is designed to kind of keep the conversation going. We found in a lot of research on instructional technologies that creating these persistent spaces, just like in our book, how we talk about the idea of creating community and creating and collaborating over information, it can make the information live a little more. It can give students a bit of ownership over it. It can allow for some uncommon questions and examples, because in many ways our book and our approach, I think, is made to kind of lay the platform for each individual instructor's scaffolding of their own experiences. So when we teach the class at West Virginia, we have 4 different faculty members who teach it. They use the readings as kind of a baseline to establish the conversations and the content. Then they turn to the social media platforms or the examples or their own examples to engage the conversations further. And the Facebook page is a really great way to kind of archive that stuff for other folks later. Takes a little more time. It also kind of puts you out there a little more often. But for those who are experienced and comfortable in the social media space, we found that the community is pretty lively in there. And the 3 of us are also heavily involved in answering questions and even sharing our own experiences from classes and content.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest benefits too, is, I mean, as we said, tech changes frequently. And so as we see new examples that fit stuff, that's a great place to post them for others to talk about as well. That's one of the things I see it being really useful for as well.
We learned a lot as authors from that conversation too. I mean, in updating from the first to second edition of Law, the dynamic that happened on the Facebook page. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
So that's pretty much our approach. And so we'd like to open this up for questions and, talk about more stuff as well. So we're open to your questions now.
Thanks a lot, guys.
All
Nick,
right,
I'm going to start following you. You had me at sandwich and beer photos.
Which is Morgantown's finest.
Yeah, that is right there. That is.
I do have a couple questions here. First one, have you used this book for online courses?
Frequently. In fact, I've used the content from this book in a lot of, so all of my classes are hybrid. So I have face-to-face content with online instruction for their assignments and for their readings and for the participation. But I've taught this class with this book and content fully online. And I've done that for high school students, like outreach programs. I've done it for the university for our undergraduate population. And we've even customized the curriculum online for our corporate programs and some of our other master's programs. So the nice thing about it being very modular and being very tech-driven is that it doesn't take a whole lot to convert this content into online spaces, whether those are going to be like recorded videos like this. Oftentimes it takes the form of a discussion post. So if folks were to visit the Facebook page and kind of envision that style of content and that style of discussion in an online forum, I think this curriculum has been more successful than other ones. A, it's on technology. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say too. It's like, it kind of has to be, doesn't it? Yeah.
But it also taps what folks are already doing every day. And I think the information is very accessible as a result, as long as they're willing to kind of disrupt what they assume technology does.
Sure, and a similar question, I guess, on that. What levels of students have you taught with this text?
Yeah, so for those everywhere, I mean, 15 to 50 and everything in between. Largely because I think the content as a scaffold is very easy to construct curriculum from. And so if you need to dial it down for somebody who's never touched the technology before versus ramp it up because they're heavily involved in it, even some graduate students who need a very kind of refresher on what is a communication approach to media. So maybe they had a classic mass communication background, but they didn't fill in as many of the theories and perspectives. And we try to do that with the text, at least on my end.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've taught it. I mean, used it in classes from 25 to 350 people. So, I mean, I think it's size class-wise, it fits pretty well for different levels too.
Yeah, kind of the same story here. I mean, I've used it in a range of class sizes. The way our curriculum works at UConn, it seems to land kind of in the middle. It's kind of a middle level elective, but we've used it for intro also with some degree of success. So I don't know that it's a grad seminar book, but we've had a lot of success on this end with like intro to mid-level elective courses. Yeah.
There's a really nice question that we received on the chat portal, and I'll read it aloud if you don't have access to it. But it seems like your work focuses on the channel-mediated technology being a main construct for a mass personal, which traditionally has been a main separator of interpersonal mass communication. How do other variables such as personalization of messages, publicness versus privateness, and imagined audience are a factor in your mediated communication book?
I mean, they are. I would probably say, and even if it's not always directly mentioned, those are the driving factors behind our thinking about how this stuff measures. And that's why we don't think it's always as useful to divide them into mass versus interpersonal, because the technology doesn't divide them. And so because of some of those exact issues that were just brought up, and those sort of, I think really the O'Sullivan idea, especially, which is one that I always like, rather than thinking about it as mass versus interpersonal, let's think about some of the characteristics of the channel that might matter more. So does the channel allow for you to be, open to everyone, or is it more of a one-on-one channel? That might be a much more important difference than simply, is there a channel or not? In fact, we would all argue that is a much more important difference. Yeah. And those are the kinds of things that, again, even if it's not always directly called out in the book, that is the underlying idea behind our approach to this idea of mass, of mediated communication.
Yeah. Yeah, it does dovetail off of that Carr and O'Sullivan argument that, that those lines are blurring between what is mediated and what is interpersonal or other forms of communication, and that it's less a function of the medium as how individuals use it. I think the medium serves as a platform for different types of interactions, but it's not deterministic in any way. And like Dave said, even when we don't explicitly state that in the book, the running kind of undercurrent, the thread of how we're approaching all these different component pieces is through that assumption, is through thinking about it in those terms.
That's right, especially when we talk about it being functional in nature. And that's a common theme in the book, is we talk about it as a tool. In fact, our Twitter hashtag was media as tools, because we try to explain that these are things that often are experienced at the individual level, right? And so folks they may not always be cognizant of their intentions when they log on and want to do something. When you think about things like personalizing their messages, making them public or private, imagining their audiences, and some of the face work that goes into that. Now, we don't teach the core, or at least the course in the book are not designed to be a skills-based course, but we're kind of navigating you through what button to push. Because in some ways, our argument was that we want you to get the theory down and the conceptual understanding down of what are some of the functions of these technologies, not only from a bells and whistles perspective of the technologies, but also what are your end goals, right? What are you engaging in when you engage in a persuasive message? When you're playing a video game and there are certain aspects of the medium that want to convince you to behave in a certain way, why do some people respond in one way and some people respond in a different way? So I think because of the functional nature of the book and this idea that technology are tools and we use them to engage in communication, it's very natural and in a way very primitive, and we do it on these 4 different dimensions, those individual differences are often the things that I think fill in the connection between how is this communication versus how is this just a focus on channels and technology.
Yep.
Excellent. Have you had any issues, or do you have any issues with the social media learning communities?
I think one issue is maybe just getting more people to be involved with it.
I think so.
I think sometimes students especially see, actually in line with this book, they see Facebook used especially, or Twitter, for a particular function. And that function for them is simply, well, I don't want to have my classroom there. One of the things we always would have to remind students is you can be part of the group and I don't have to be your friend, for example. In fact, I don't want to be your friend. It's like, you don't want to be mine, that's fine. So we're not creeping on you. We're not using this as some kind of way of, oh, we're watching to see what else you're putting on your own private Facebook. I don't care. And so I think that was part, at least at one time, I remember that was an issue. But I think just getting people more involved with it and getting them to realize, hey, all that stuff we talk about in the book is sort of this Web 2.0, this being part of the community. We want to use it that way too. So
there's a shyness, I think, sometimes. It ebbs and flows. What we notice, and I notice this quite a bit, is that when you have a critical mass of like 3 to 5 opinion leaders or posters that aren't the three of us, folks coalesce around them, which, by the way, is part of our chapter to talk about Pareto principles and the distribution of social media engagement and opinion leaders and discussion leaders. But modeling that in the educational space, which requires them to kind of what Dave said, which interestingly enough is a theme of the book, is that you can use these technologies for lots of different things. You can both talk to your friends in one space and talk to your professors and other professors in another space. But I think sometimes students are also kind of taught to be very cautious about anything they say online. Because they don't want to be wrong, they don't want to be embarrassed. And so sometimes they're just shy to say something. We notice that the adopters who often drive traffic to the page, you'll see these blips. And oftentimes when they notice that Ken and Dave and I aren't going to jump down their throats and tell them how wrong they are, we get some excitement going. Sometimes what we try to do is bring in guests for people that we cited in the book and try to get them to post a little bit. But it really is that sort of first adopter issue. When you've got one class that's active, the other classes know what to point to. So sometimes we try to seed the conversations, or we encourage other adopters to kind of mix up the voices. But if they only see a couple names, they just get nervous about, I don't want to share my opinions in a space where I could be wrong. And we try to explain that in many ways that is the purpose of the space.
Right. Now, the flip side of that apprehension too, I should follow up, is that I think there is a sense of awareness that their instructors and or the three of us are there and are monitoring. So we haven't really had any problems, at least not to my knowledge, with any kind of like bullying behavior, social behavior. Not at all. I mean, they're still aware that this is part of like what's happening at school. And I think in a way that sense of authority kind of prevents antisocial behavior from happening in the environment. So we haven't had any problems. Let's put it that way.
We got a problem right now with Nick's phone. That's about
it.
Nick's
phone's a problem right now.
Lines operator standing by, right? I mean,
are you inducing scarcity? Yeah.
See, it's not only new technology that bothers people sometimes. It's old technology too.
I almost threw it off the ledge just now, so more.
You've done a lot with the social media learning communities. What else have you designed to help adopting this course or this text? What else have you developed to help in that transition?
Anyone there? So I mean, there are some like more traditional PowerPoint slide things that people can utilize and then adapt for their own purposes, and there are like exam bank test question stuff that people can utilize too. But I mean, a lot of our focus has been on, in terms of the extra stuff, making it more in line with the theme of the book, making it more of the community aspect of it too. So,
but kind of the traditional things that you'd expect as far as supplemental materials are there also.
So I was like, am I forgetting anything? I can't remember now.
Yeah, we have the basic PowerPoint stuff and the test bank stuff. We've actually had a lot of adopters contact us individually, which I've had a lot of fun with. Just some quick emails here and there where I've shared some sort of the stuff that I've customized over the years at WVU. That I've been willing to share that kind of information. Updating test banks every few years, or for example, the question earlier about the different modalities teaching the class, sharing assignment formats. So I've taught this class in a mass lecture of 375, but I've also taught this class in an honors course of 24 students. And so the scalability of the material there, on the one hand, is a big plus, but also can be kind of intimidating if there's not a lot of like set in stone product. But some of that stuff we've not necessarily put through the publisher's sites because it contains proprietary information on campuses and things like that. But we've had a good community there. I've actually had folks through the Facebook page message me about content for their classes and ask, like, how do I turn this Facebook group into content for the class? So I think in a way, the three of us saw the digitization of the class and doing it on social media not as a way just to sort of force users of social media, but as a way to make this sort of stuff intrinsically dynamic. I mean, that group grows and builds and chats every day. And our hope was that that would be an impetus for kind of establishing more of a community feel to where folks could reach out to us. They could just scrape that page if they wanted to. So we've often had people not asking us so much like for this particular file or format, but they've actually asked us a lot of open-ended questions about how would you convert X to Y. And so those have been some of the materials. That being said, we also have like eCampus modules and things like that, that just from our past usage, we can usually transfer some of those things.
Yeah, in that line, some of it is like some of the resource for better and for worse is us.
Yeah. Yeah, making ourselves available, I think was, I think some folks have gotten that message too, right? With the emails, with the Facebook messages, with the tags, and we're okay with that because this stuff does move so quickly. I think I remember the three of us, in edition 1, we had written about Google Glass, and then it was gone by the time.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, in the first edition, it was the MC in action was Google Glass is coming. And then in the second edition was, oh, and now it's gone.
That's what happened while you were away.
Right. Yeah. And that was only a couple years. So, I mean, yeah.
But at the same time, the content is more based on concept from comm theory that does allow it to transcend and even predict some of these crashes. We had this experience at South by Southwest recently where some of the authors, we were down at a panel listening to the founders of Yik Yak talk about their changing platform. And we turned to each other and we talked about how that wasn't a very good idea. And I think, Dave, within 6 months.
Oh, I just remember someone's line who was not in this one, but their comment was, well, they just basically ended themselves. And like 6 months they had,
Yeah, so that was a neat thing to kind of see that some of these concepts and theories endure far beyond the platforms by which they're based. And I think that was something we try to exist on. So some of the materials we recommend to people are actually readings of some other comm theories that maybe didn't work their way to the curriculum traditionally, but could work their way to the curriculum now. Yeah. And those references are on each chapter. They're at the back of the page as well. And they're usually pretty accessible.
Thank you so much. Speaking of accessible, the three of you, I'll be providing your email address to all the attendees if they have further questions. You've done a great job of being involved in that process. I'd like to thank the three of you for your time today and for all the attendees. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to share with the panel or the attendees before we sign off?
Well, I mean, just thanks for putting up with us and listening to us for a little while. And thanks for participating.
Yes, thanks for your interest. Yes.
If you want to see some beautiful photos of us, those are up right now, along with some contact information too. Feel free.
Of hair on the face and head. Yeah.
Mine's, I have less gray in that picture, so that's, that's good, I guess, or not, whatever. But it's there. So, Nick, you pretty much look the same. I mean, you basically are
wearing the same coat, in fact.
Yeah, well, different T-shirt maybe, but other than that, pretty much the same. Yeah.
I think I would encourage folks to reach out. I mean, sincerely, I think there's a conversation to be had, and I think our orientation with the text and with the social media platforms and with keeping things open rather than closed and thinking of the course more modularly, more as a scaffolding and maybe less of a turnkey operation, although it certainly can be, and more of something you can scaffold into how you understand technology or how you might want to understand technology. I've been surprised at the variety of ways the material has been used when I've heard from folks, and I'm happy to share some of those things via email or Facebook or, well, these guys know I'm online 24/7. So
Ken and I aren't as often maybe, but that's okay.
But yeah, thank you so much, guys. Have a great day. I'll be sending a recording of this out to all the attendees shortly. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Cheers.
Have a great day.